Hello, and welcome to today's ACM Tech Talk. This webcast is part of ACM's commitment to lifelong learning and professional development, serving the global community of nearly 100,000 computing professionals and students. I'm Will Trace, Lockheed Martin Fellow Emeritus, former chair of ACM SIGSOF and member of the ACM Professional Development Committee, and it's my privilege to serve as the moderator for today's Tech Talk. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with ACM or what it has to offer, here's some information. ACM offers educational and professional development resources that bolster skills and enhance career opportunities. Our members can stay competitive in the constantly changing world of computing with a range of ACM Learning Center resources at learning.acm.org. You can see some of the highlights on your screen. ACM recognizes the role of computing in driving the innovations that sustain competitiveness in a global environment. ACM provides timely computing information published by ACM, including Communications to ACM and my favorite, Q magazine. Access to ACM Digital Library, the world's most comprehensive database on computing literature. International conferences, like the International Conference on Software Engineering this May in Seoul, Korea, that draw leading experts on broad spectrum of computing topics. Support for education and research, including curriculum development, teacher training, and the ACM Turing and ACM Prize in Computing Awards. And the updated Code of Ethics, a collection of principles and guidelines designed to help computing professionals make ethically responsible decisions in professional practices. In summary, ACM enables its members to solve critical problems using new technologies that enriches our lives and advances our society in the digital age. Before we get started, for those of you joining us for the first time, I'd like to quickly mention a few housekeeping items shown on the slide in front of you. First, the slides will advance automatically throughout the event. On the bottom panel, you will find some additional widgets and resources like how to download the slides. If you are experiencing problems with slides or audio, press the F5 key in Windows, Command-R if you're on a Mac, or refresh your browser on a mobile device. Or you can close and relaunch the presentation. To control volume, adjust the master volume on your computer. If you have any questions during the talk, which I encourage, please type them into the Q&A box at any time and click the Submit button. I'll organize the questions and ask Steve, and when we have time at the end of the presentation. This session is being recorded and will be archived. You will receive an automatic email notification when it becomes available, and check learning.acm.org for updates on this and other upcoming webcasts. At the end of the presentation, you'll see a survey. Open up your screen. Please take a minute to fill it out. Help us improve our tech talks. You may also open the link to the survey at any time from the resources window on your screen. Finally, you can use Facebook and Twitter widgets on the bottom panel to share the presentation link with your friends, as well as tweet comments and questions using the hashtag #ACM Learning. We'll be watching for your tweets. We also have a community discourse page to continue the discussion after this webcast, including questions we won't be able to get through during the Q&A session. Today's presentation is 7 Unbreakable Rules of Software Leadership by Steve McConnell. Steve is the CEO and Chief Software Engineer at Construct Software, where he consults to a broad range of industries and oversees Construct consulting and training offerings. Steve is the best-selling author of the industry classic Code Complete, as well as Software Estimation, Demystifying the Black Art, Rapid Development, and other titles. Steve has served as the editor-in-chief of IEEE Software Magazine and the chair of IEEE Computer Society's Professional Activities Board. Readers of Software Development Magazine voted Steve one of the 3 most influential people in software industry, along with Bill Gates and Leonard Torvalds. He also is an ACM member. Steve, without further ado, I'm looking forward to hearing your talk today.
Great. Well, Will, thank you for that introduction. I appreciate the introduction. I realized I should have probably given you a little bit of an update, which is I published a book late last year called More Effective Agile, a Roadmap for Leaders. And I think that's a good segue into the topic of this talk, which is 7 Unbreakable Rules of Software Leadership. I think, as you said, I think I'm best known as the author of Code Complete, which is a very specific programming level book. But I wrote the first edition of that book more than 25 years ago, and my interests have continued to evolve since then. Over the last 15 years, I've focused a lot more on the leadership topic than I have on the construction topic. I hosted an executive roundtable in the Seattle area for senior VP software leaders for more than 10 years. I've hosted a software leadership summit for 15 years now in Seattle that happens every fall. As time has gone by, I've had increasing contact with executives up to the C-level, meaning CEO, COO, CFO, and so on. And then I think personally relevant, my job at Constructs for 20 years has been the leader, and we're a small company, so sometimes I feel sheepish about saying that I'm the CEO of a small company, but I am the top person in my company, so I have a perspective on leadership from that point of view as well. So that's really where I'm coming at on the topic today, is 7 unbreakable rules of leadership based on this increasing exposure over the years and really at a personal level, an increasing emphasis on leadership. Now, clearly, there's no shortage of advice on leadership. In fact, there's myriad advice on leadership, ranging from delegate to defining an inspiring vision to making sure that you let other people take the credit, to think win-win, sharpen the saw, even just everything I needed to know I learned in kindergarten, show up on time, leading by example, don't micromanage. There just are all kinds of advices on leadership. So I don't know that it's useful to go through some long laundry list of additional advice. Moreover, I think there's actually no shortage of numbered advice on leadership. For example, you can get the 1-minute manager. You can get 2-in-a-box relationship model. You can get level 3 leadership. You can get the 4 obsessions of an extraordinary executive. You can get to level 5 leadership. And in case you think I'm cheating here because the book doesn't actually have a 5 in the title, there's the 5 practices of exemplary leadership. There's the Institute for level 6 leadership. There are the 7 habits of highly effective people. There are 8 leadership qualities that matter most in the real world. There's 9 lessons of successful school leadership teams. There are 10 principles from the nation's most powerful leadership lab. Well, I think you kind of get the idea. But in case that's not enough, we've got the United States Army's 11 leadership principles. We've got the 12 leadership principles of Dean Smith. So basically, any number of principles you want, you can get. And that's probably enough to get the idea. But in case you think that that's the limit, it's not. We've got John C. Maxwell's 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, which, by the way, I think is a terrific book. And then we've got the Marine Corps' 30 management principles. So really, we can get as many numbered leadership principles as we want. I think 7 is a good number, and at least for the unbreakable rules that I think software leaders should be aware of, I have distilled it down to the 7 that I think are the most important. So let's just go ahead and dive into those. Number 1, unbreakable rule number 1 is be sure you're going somewhere. And this rule to me depends on the difference between, I see anyway, between leadership and management. I think classically when people distinguish between leading and managing, they say, well, you lead people and you manage things, where things are tasks or processes or work product and so on. And I think this distinction has never resonated completely with me because it's hard to find examples of managing things where part of the management job isn't also managing people. If we're managing tasks or processes, there are people doing those tasks or processes. What I find a much more useful way to look at leading versus managing is to compare what has classically been described as a wartime versus a peacetime leader. And this to me is an interesting distinction. A peacetime leader is really a leader who focuses on stability and management and comfort. The situation is at peace. People don't want things to change because things are good. They want to maintain the status quo. And I think this really calls for management, not leadership. We're not going to go anywhere. We like where we are. We're going to stay there. In contrast, wartime is a time of chaos and change. People are not happy with the current situation, and so they want a leader to lead them out of the chaos and change toward peace and stability. They don't want to stay where they are. They do want to go somewhere, and so that does call for a leader. And so I think leadership really means leading somewhere. By definition, if people aren't following you, you're not a leader. And if you're not going somewhere, then people can't really follow you. And so I think that a good way to look at this is I grew up in the town of Puyallup, which I'm not even going to try to spell for you because the spelling is almost kind of a joke. But Puyallup was founded by a pioneer named Ezra Meeker, and he led a wagon train on the Oregon Trail to Puyallup in 1862. After leading the wagon train, through the mountains and so on, he settled in the Puyallup Valley and grew hops. So he basically led his people to prosperity, and then he was done. It was peacetime. The people didn't really need a leader anymore, and so they settled into more of a management mode. But I think it's interesting here that leadership and management can be cyclical. Sometimes you need one, sometimes you need another. And Ezra Meeker, in 1906, at the age of 76, decided that the country had forgotten about the Oregon Trail and that it needed to be remembered. And so he traveled east over the Oregon Trail with a covered wagon and a team of oxen, eventually all the way to New York City. So he basically became a leader again on a somewhat different topic, more leading in remembering history at that point, rather than establishing a new community, but it was still another form of leadership. Now, I think the business world has basically become all wartime. It's characterized by constant change, and I think most of the history of the software world fits into this pattern. We've had short periods of relative stability, maybe with IBM in the 1970s, Microsoft in the 80s, but stability is a relative term. There's always lots and lots of change, which I think means that in the software world, we actually need leadership more often than we need management, because things are constantly changing and we want people to lead us through that change. Now, one of the interesting things about leading in a software context is that I think if you're leading people somewhere, they want to know where you're going. And so I think I'll get to that in a little bit more in a minute, but I think providing a clear vision is part of that. And I like what John C. Maxwell says on this, that to define where you're going, you need to lead with the heart. His comment is, you must win people's hearts before you win their minds. And basically, if people want a leader at all, they want to trust their leader and they want to make an emotional commitment to their leader. And to do that, they need to know where the leader is going. And so part of Unbreakable rule number 1, which is be sure you're going somewhere, is define a clear destination. And you might think that this is, and you need to find a clear destination for leading with the heart. You might think that this isn't all that relevant to software staff who are supposed to be more cerebral and intellectual, but we see lots of instances where software staff practically kill themselves to get a release done, and it's not because their leader obtained an intellectual commitment, but it's because the leader somehow won the staff's hearts as well as their minds. And of course, I think you have to accomplish both of these in parallel. With software staff, a good way to lose people's hearts is to not engage their minds. But I think the bigger risk in software is to forget about the issue of winning their hearts. An anti-pattern that we saw with one client in a really high-growth company was that he decided that the right way to try to lead was to try a lot of stuff and see what works. And so he tried Agile, and he tried some SEI stuff. He tried some ISO 9000 stuff. I think this might be okay policy, maybe in a management mode, but I think it was not great leadership. And we saw all of these initiatives wither on the vine at that particular company. On the opposite end of the scale, we worked with a company that had a software staff of about 500 people, and they listed their software vision in very clear terms in their building lobby, and then followed up on that in other communications. So every day when people came and went from their workspaces, they saw a repetition of the vision. The destination was really, really clear, and I think that was a better example of defining a clear destination and being sure that you're going somewhere. I think what we have seen over the years in companies that succeed with large-scale organizational change initiatives is because someone saw clearly that leadership was needed. That is, they saw that the organization needed to go somewhere, and then they led the organization to that destination. I don't agree with the idea that you can manage a change initiative by definition. Managing is about a stable situation that's not changing, and so I don't think you can manage a change initiative. It's almost a contradiction in terms. You have to lead it. So Unbreakable rule number 2 is take responsibility. And this is very much based on experience that I've had working with leaders and over the years. we run this local discussion group, or we don't anymore, but we did for more than 10 years, run a local discussion group of software VPs mostly. And one of the interesting challenges in running this group was that we had surprisingly high turnover in the group. Turnover not because people left the group per se, but because they actually lost their leadership jobs. And I would say that we lost probably about a third of the people per year because they had lost their leadership position and they weren't qualified to be in the group anymore. And as time went by, we actually developed what we viewed as a pretty good predictor of whether somebody was going to keep their job or lose it, which was basically what we ended up characterizing as victim mentality. If we had someone in the group who kept saying, oh, I want to do this, but my, CEO won't let me do it, or I want to do that, but my, I've not been able to get approval from my CFO. Or we also refer to this as playing the powerless card. But in general, anytime we heard somebody say very often something along the lines of they won't let me do it, we saw that as a leading indicator of a lack of job security for that person. The people who kept their jobs were people who, instead of saying the CEO won't let me do it, would say, okay, so here's my plan that I've been going through to get buy-in from the CEO and to explain to the CEO why we need this. And those people tended, A, to actually be able to do what they wanted to do, and B, they would keep their jobs over time because they actually had more, they were taking more responsibility and having more sense of control over their jobs. I think take responsibility is a really active concept. It's not accept responsibility. It's not, reluctantly bear the mantle of leadership that has been thrust on you. No, the word is take. It's an active verb. And, I could even say seize responsibility, and that might even be a better way to characterize what I'm saying. And I think one example of how far this goes is I'm in Seattle area, so I'm a Seattle Seahawks fan. And I think one of the interesting things about football commentary is the commentary around successful quarterbacks. Like one of the comments that we have around Russell Wilson, the Seattle Seahawks quarterback, is that almost every game, at least every game where he's playing well, you'll hear one of the commentators say, they'll talk about his field vision, they'll talk about his command of the field, and they'll make comments like, he is taking responsibility for everything on the field. Or they'll make a comment like, he has taken the game and put it on his back and carried the team to a successful conclusion. And, is Russell Wilson literally taking the team and putting on his back? No. Is he literally doing everything on the field? Is he doing all the blocking and all the pass receiving? No, of course not. But the idea being here that everything that could conceivably be within his span of control, he is going to take responsibility for in a very, very active way. There is nothing that he could do that he's going to say is outside of my scope, or he's going to say, no, that's not really my responsibility. That somebody else has to do that. I'm not going to try to have an influence on that. No, he's going to try to have an influence on pretty much everything he possibly can. We had an interesting example at the first year we ran our Software Leadership Summit in Seattle. We had a very well-known speaker who had talked about a project where the technical practices had gone pretty well, and was kind of raving about how well the technical practices had worked. And so at the end, during the Q&A, one of the attendees, and this was all an executive leadership attendee group, one of the attendees asked him, okay, well, fine, you said the technical practices went well, but how well did the product do in the marketplace? And the speaker said, well, it was one of those cases where it was a technical success, but it was kind of a sales and marketing failure, and so the product didn't do well in the marketplace. And the audience practically rose out of its seat as one person and said, no, we don't accept the idea that there can be a technical success and a management failure. If it truly was a technical success, it wouldn't have been I said management failure, I meant marketing failure. If it truly was a technical success, you would have taken responsibility as an active concept for making sure that the product concept was good enough that it wouldn't be a marketing failure. It would be a marketing success because the technical staff had taken responsibility for that too. And so the concept here is really just that you can't wait for the responsibility to be given to you. Sometimes you have to take it. And that involves really having a broad view, maybe the broadest possible view of what your job entails. I think this also includes the idea of leading both up and down. You know, as software leaders, we're asked to lead our companies and software initiatives. And I've been doing this for a long time now. You know, as Will mentioned in the introduction, my first book, Code Complete, came out more than 25 years ago. I've been doing this long enough to see what happens to people's careers when they try to do the right thing versus when they don't. I think that you get a lot of respect for trying to do the right thing, even if it isn't popular. You get more respect than if you take the easy path of just going along with what somebody's telling you to do. When I wrote a book 20 years ago called Rapid Development, and I had some interesting reports from people who had moved up pretty fast in their organizations, and they would say, you know, I basically just followed the advice in your book and I got promoted. And I think that one of the pieces of advice in that book that they were referring to is basically just standing up for what you think makes sense as a technical leader for the business of your organization. And I think sometimes people perceive telling the truth as a career limiting move. But I think what's really career limiting is not telling the truth. If you set expectations poorly and then you fail to deliver on the expectations you've set, that's really what ends up being a career limiting move. And that's what to avoid. So I think, you know, leading down, of course, we always think about leading the staff under us, but we also have to lead the staff over us at times. And this is yet another example of we take responsibility. You know, probably no one is telling us it's our responsibility to lead our managers or our C-level people, but that is part of the job if we're actually going to lead effectively. Unbreakable rule number 4 is make decisions in the face of ambiguity. I think this is a case where if I was giving this talk to sales and marketing executives, I don't know that I would have to make this point, but I think for software people, we often have this issue of analysis paralysis. And so the notion of making decisions especially in the face of ambiguity, is really important. I'll start with an anti-pattern, which is the story of a vice president who had contacted me and said, hey, I'm not sure what to do, and maybe you can give me some advice. I've got a project that we're working on. We came to a fork in the road in the design about 6 months ago, and my team had these really long discussions about which design approach to take. There were 2 camps in the discussion, and they couldn't reach any kind of agreement. And so I finally said, okay, fine, you can each go the direction you want to go. And so they each worked for 6 months on their own design approaches. And now 6 months have gone by, and it's time to merge their results of their work. And so he asked me, so what do I do? And I didn't even know how to respond. My real answer was basically, okay, get a time machine, go back 6 months, grow a backbone, and have the team choose one design approach rather than 2. Because by the time he was at the point he was asking me the question, there's no way to fix that problem. They've invested 6 months of work in 2 divergent paths. There's not going to be an easy way to bring those paths back together. So this was a case where the anti-pattern here was he didn't make a decision in the face of ambiguity. He needed to make a decision, one decision, and actually lead by showing what direction the team should be going. You know, I like the advice in the Marine Corps Guide, this book, The 30 Management Principles, that I briefly pointed out earlier in the talk. They make the point that a 70% solution well executed is often better than a 90% solution that's delayed, meaning you only know 70% of what you need to know before you begin executing, or 70% of what you'd like to know before you begin executing. And this is extremely counterintuitive to analytical, technical people, because we're often pretty uncomfortable if we don't know 100%. We're uncomfortable if we only know 98%. And so the idea that we should make decisions based on a 70% knowledge base is pretty unintuitive to us and very uncomfortable. But this is something we have to get to a comfort level with if we're going to be effective leaders. Maybe we can be practitioners or hands-on individual contributors needing to know everything, but as a leader, we can't have that standard. I was fortunate enough to have a really formative early experience with ambiguity that was very frustrating at the time, but ended up being one of my more valuable life lessons. I did an internship in college for a company, and I basically had worked through all the work they had for me by halfway through the summer, and so they were trying to make up stuff for me to do. And my boss ended up handing me a box of unlabeled floppy diskettes and saying, you know, this was left by somebody who doesn't work here anymore. I'd like you to find something useful to do with this. And my response was, okay, what do you want me to do? And he said, I don't know what I want you to do. Part of your job is figure out what you should do with this. And At the time, being very junior, I pushed back pretty hard and said, you got to give me more direction than that. What do you want me to do with this? I don't even know what my task is. And he said, well, I don't know what you need to do with this either. You need to figure that out as part of your task. And at the time, that was very frustrating. But as time has gone by, I think that actually characterizes most of my job, which is looking at an ambiguous situation, trying to figure out what the most important or most useful thing to do is, and then doing that. When you get to the top leadership level, there's really nobody that's going to tell you what needs to be done. A big part of your job is figuring out what needs to be done and allocating your time in the ways that are most important. And so this experience that I had as an intern, which was incredibly frustrating at the time, actually ended up being the bulk of my job day to day for the last, at least the last 10 or 15 years. So I think that one other comment on the 70% idea is that if the situation actually calls for leadership, that is, it's characterized by chaos, it usually isn't realistic to expect to find a 90% solution. You have to execute the 70% solution because there's so much chaos. You're never going to know what the 90% solution will be. And if you wait for it, you'll be waiting forever. And so I think, as I said at the beginning of this slide, the tendency toward analysis paralysis, I think it's an occupational hazard for software people. It's just something that we have to overcome. This is, I like Marshall Goldsmith's book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And I think this is one of those examples where what got us here might have been a really exceptional ability at analysis and exceptional ability to engage with details. That's not going to get us where we need to go as a leader. We need to give up our liking of that and get comfortable in a different mode. Unbreakable rule number 4 is put the organization first. And I think that I'll again start with an anti-pattern. We had a client that we were working with on an organizational design workshop, basically trying to figure out how they could revise their reporting structure and how their staff was organized. And in the context of that workshop, it became clear that the test group needed to be significantly reorganized. But the highest level VP of development was not willing to do that because there wouldn't be any place for the VP of test to go after the reorganization. And it was pretty clear to us that the VP of test was part of the problem, and he wasn't cooperating with the change, and the overall VP of development wasn't willing to actually take action. And as a result, he ended up basically sacrificing the whole organization because he wasn't willing to make a hard decision that would have adversely affected this one person. And that really slowed down or stopped the growth that organization was able to experience. The counterexample, I think, is from one of my favorite movies, the movie Master and Commander. And in the movie, there's a scene where there's a huge storm. The main sail mast breaks, and the sail and the mast fall into the water. There's a sailor at the top of the mast that falls with him. The storm is really fierce, and the ship begins to lift strongly to one side. Basically, the first lieutenant turns to the captain and points out that the mast and the sail are acting as an anchor. They're jeopardizing the whole crew. At that point, the captain then takes an axe and chops the lines free. He leaves the man who is at the top of the mast, who's now in the water. He leaves him to certain death, but he saves the ship and he saves the crew. And I think there are two interesting leadership points to this, at least from my point of view. One is, the obvious one is that the leader sometimes has to make decisions that save the whole enterprise, but at the expense of individual parties. And I would say that if you can't get to this point, the reality is you're not going to rise very high in your organization. If you're not willing to put the organization first, it's not in the organization's interest to have you in a position where you're called to do that. And so you're just not going to be put in that position. So I think that's kind of the obvious point. I think the less obvious point here is that the leader actually has to make the decision. The leader shoulders the responsibility for making the decision. In this case, the first lieutenant knew what had to be done and essentially communicated that to the captain. But the first lieutenant was not the one who had to make the decision. When the captain grabbed the axe and chopped the ropes, the captain took responsibility and the first lieutenant did not. And I think that's a really interesting part of this, is that the information pattern was really clear. Everybody could see what was going on. But part of the leadership, the mantle of leadership, is being the one who actually makes the decision, takes responsibility to put the organization first. And in this case, the captain is the one who did that. So, and we've seen examples. We've seen many examples over the years, and many counter examples. We've seen, in one good example we saw, we had a company that had a significant team working on a product that was, and there were, as I recall, around 100 people on this team, but the development pace on that team was pretty slow. And so they set up a skunkworks project that had 10% of the people, and that project ended up being able to move more quickly. And that company ended up disbanding the 100-person team and shifting responsibility for product development over to the much smaller team. Again, it's a painful decision to disrupt the larger number of people, but it was for the good of the overall organization. And really, at the end of the day, having a thriving organization where lots and lots of people can be successful is more important than having one team that does well, but at the expense of everyone else across the organization. So I think the idea of putting the organization first is one that's difficult for software people. It's really tied into that idea of taking responsibility. Sometimes it's tied into that idea of making decisions, even when there's a lot of ambiguity, but you have to do it if you want to be an effective leader. Unbreakable rule number 5 is to be passionate about your company's business. And I think this is an interesting one. One of the really interesting parts of my job for the last 20 years has been getting to see how many interesting different businesses make heavy use of software. And obviously there are all these high-profile companies like the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Apple, and so on, which are obviously doing a lot of software. But there are lots and lots of other companies that are, selling shoes or setting up wholesale markets for produce distributors, making literal hardware like locks and keys in the trucking or heavy manufacturing industries, finance industry, of course, oil and gas. There are lots and lots of companies that are not even remotely primarily software companies that are making heavy use of software. And I think if you're a tech person, it's pretty interesting to get excited about a technologically exciting business. If you're working on glitzy consumer electronics or cell phones or something like that, when the business itself is not particularly leading edge, you're working on shoes or door locks or trucks or banking, maybe it's a little bit harder to get excited about the business. But what I will say is that the senior leadership in the business is excited about their business. And they are looking for someone in the software staff who is competent on the software side, but who is also completely committed to the business. Because they don't really care about software. They care about software as it supports their business. If they get the idea that the leader of the software is in some way not fully supporting the business, then they're not going to be excited about that leader. And so becoming passionate about your company's business ends up being something where I think the passion for software comes automatically because we're in the field. The passion for the business, I think, is something that, sometimes is a blind spot for leaders who come at this from a software background. And, I had a very sobering experience with one of the companies we worked with where we had a VP of development who had brought us in and was very passionate about software improvement, but who the senior leadership pulled me aside and said, this guy obviously is committed about software, but we don't really think he's the right guy to lead software in our business. And can you help us find somebody to replace him? Extremely awkward situation. But I repeat the story mostly just as a warning example of the fact that senior leadership really does care about business, and a senior software leader, it's really going to behoove you to demonstrate passion, not just for software, but also for the business. Unbreakable rule number 6, become a student of communication. And I think this has all kinds of different manifestations. One is that you have to learn to adapt your communication style to your audience. If you're talking to your technical individual contributors, you're going to talk to them one way. If you're talking to your leads, you're going to talk to them a different way. If you're talking to your customers, you probably talk to them a different way. If you're talking to your sales and marketing peers, you're going to talk to them a different way. If you're talking to your senior leadership, you're going to talk to them still a different way. What I've seen over the years is that whereas sales staff and marketing staff would view this as textbook, this communication 101, we find technical people actually believing that the idea that adapting your communication style to your audience is somehow dishonest or impure. And so we find this, in many cases, ended up being a self-imposed glass ceiling on people's careers because they refuse to adapt a more flexible communication approach. And to me, this is just all about accuracy and fidelity. The reason that you're adapting your communication style is that you want your message to be received the way that you intend it. And if you just communicate to a senior leader the way you communicate to your technical staff, the technical staff will receive the message the way you intend it. But communicating the same way to your senior leadership, they won't receive it the way you intend it. So, even if you look at this just from an accuracy point of view, you have to adapt your style to your audience. We have lots of connection between becoming a student of communication and the other rules. Literal leadership, that is letting people know where you're going. Well, you got to communicate to them to let them know where you're going. Take responsibility. Well, part of the leader's job is to take responsibility, but part of the leader's job is to let other people know that you're taking responsibility. They need to know that you're responsible, because if they don't know that you're responsible, well, they'll either think that nobody's responsible, or they'll worry that maybe they should be being responsible, and that causes them anxiety. So when you take responsibility, you have to do it in a visible way that relieves other people of the responsibility burden. Same thing about decisiveness. You have to let other people know what you've decided. And that's really part of letting them know where you're going. You make decisions. The decisions are often about where you're going. And then the passion needs to be visible too. You need to communicate the passion. You can't just be passionate quietly. If you don't communicate to the people around you that you're passionate about the business, then they won't even know. And I think the final point, which is again, a point that I probably wouldn't need to make to sales and marketing audience, but I think I do need to make to technical audiences, you have to remember to actually do the communication. And this does not come naturally to many of us, but it's something that we have to work at. And even if we literally have to set reminders in our calendar, that's what we should do, because we need to be sure we're actually doing the communication. We had a really interesting interaction at Symantec where one of the things they told us was that when they're looking for program managers, they look for what they call hyper communicators. And their definition of a hyper communicator is someone who naturally communicates more under stress. To me, this was fascinating, because I do think that a lot of technical people shut down and communicate less under stress. And Symantec had identified that we don't want people whose natural tendency is to shut down and communicate less under stress in this role. In the PM role, we really want someone who's going to naturally seek out other people and communicate more. So become a student of communication. I think this really is tied into all of the other principles or unbreakable rules in one way or another. All right, the final unbreakable rule is unbreakable rule number 7, which is treat your staff as volunteers. I think this to me is one, I think most of these other rules you could probably find in some book or other, but this is one I think you're not going to find very many places. And for me, this was a little bit of a discovery, I think more so than some of the other rules. I spent 4 years as editor-in-chief of IEEE Software Magazine. Sorry to bring that up in an ACM publication, but that was the one I was involved with. As with the ACM publications, the IEEE publication is 99% volunteer-based publication, where the authors are volunteers, nobody gets paid. The manuscript reviewers are volunteers, nobody gets paid. The editorial board and advisory boards are volunteers, nobody gets paid, including me as editor-in-chief. I wasn't getting paid. And so at some point, somebody asked me, I know that you run your own company and you can tell people what to do, but here on the magazine, you've got all volunteers. How do you motivate staff where nobody's getting paid and everyone's a volunteer? And it was an interesting question to me, because I realized that to me there was no difference. I had always effectively run my company as if everyone was a volunteer, and so I was really not approaching the magazine any differently. And I think that if you look at the history of software development, the history of the software world has been that there's been a perennial labor shortage. We've had explosive growth the entire history of software development. We had a brief pause during the dot-com collapse, but I think that's the only pause we've had in 50 years. Software developers are extremely mobile. And most of the history of the software universe have been able to change jobs easily. And so I've always felt like I never had a really strong hold on anyone who worked for me. I always had to basically get their buy-in to do the work that I was hoping that they would do. And so people really have to want to do the work. For many software people, it's not about the money. They could earn the same money lots of different places. It really goes back to the idea of I think part of it goes back to the idea of what I talked about with John C. Maxwell. You have to win their hearts as well as their minds. And if you win their hearts, then they'll continue to work for you. One of the other things I think is interesting about software is that it's all mental work. And we're effectively renting space in people's brains. We are paying them to think about what we want them to think about. And we can't compel anyone to think about anything. We can only create conditions that make them want to think about what we want them to think about. And again, I think that goes back to the idea of, in essence, that's like treating them as volunteers. The fact that we're paying them doesn't mean they're going to do what we want them to do necessarily. They have to want to do it. And so I think that's a really interesting aspect of the software development leadership challenge. Dan O'Reilly wrote this interesting book called Predictably Irrational. And in chapter 4 of the book, he has a very interesting discussion, which he calls the cost of social norms. Why are we happy to do things, but not when we are paid to do them? And he makes this has a really interesting discussion of the difference between a social relationship and an economic relationship. And one of the points he makes is that once you convert a social relationship to an economic relationship, it's really hard to go back, and you probably lose a lot of the value of the social relationship. And he doesn't tell this story, but I will tell a story that I think you'll get the point of it instantly, which is I've actually received messages like this multiple times from people, but the basic idea is we were working on a rush. People contact me and say, we were working on this high priority project. The staff was bought into the project, and so as a team, we collectively agreed that we were going to stay a couple hours late each day, and we were going to come in on Saturdays, and we were going to work a full day on Saturday. We voluntarily committed many hours of overtime to try to get this release done. And at the end of the project, we did get the release done. We felt good about it. It was a very successful release. And the Monday after the release, the manager comes in and gave each of us a $50 Starbucks card as an expression of appreciation for all of our hard work. Well, I think this is a terrible story because it's too easy to do the math on the $50 Starbucks card. People are looking at the hours they put in and they're saying, well, geez, I'm getting paid less than $1 an hour for all the overtime I put in. The manager had essentially converted the social relationship where people were doing something to support each other and support their team and feel good about the work that they'd done. The manager converted that social relationship to an economic relationship. And whereas people were happy to do the work, they were not happy to do it when they were paid to do it, at least not for getting paid that amount. And, so I think people want to feel appreciated. They want to, like Microsoft for many years had private offices, and I think there was definitely a concentration benefit from the private offices, but I think the real purpose of private offices is to make people feel appreciated. It shows the company's willing to invest in them. It's not just treating them as a fungible unit of productivity, but it's actually caring about them as a person. I think, the kinds of benefits that companies like Google and Facebook are giving today, I think, again, a big point of the messaging there is about we appreciate you, we value you, and I think that kind of comes back to the point of treating the staff as volunteers. These companies are aware that the labor market today is incredibly tight. It's very, very competitive for hiring companies, and so we have to work that way. Very early in my career, I went to a supervisor workshop, and at the beginning of the workshop, the leader had us take a name tag, and we were supposed to write the letters MMFI on the name tag. And so we were walking around all day with these name tags that said MMFI, but she wouldn't tell us what it meant. And toward the end of the day, she said, okay, now I'm going to tell you what this means. It means make me feel important. MMFI stands for make me feel important. And really, to be an effective supervisor, you should visualize every person that you are leading as wearing a name tag that says, make me feel important, and then you should actually act on that and make them feel important. So, and I think that that's really good advice. I think over the years we've worked with many, many companies. We've seen many companies where the software staff isn't paid as well as staff at nearby companies, but the staff turnover is still very low, and the staff satisfaction appears to be high. In those cases, I think it's because this last rule is being followed well. They are treating their staff as volunteers. They're making them feel important. They're recognizing that, yeah, there's an economic relationship there, but there's a social relationship that probably matters more. All right, well, that brings us to the end of our 7 rules. To summarize, the 7 unbreakable rules are: be sure you're going somewhere, take responsibility as an active concept, make decisions in the face of ambiguity, even if you don't know all the information that you need to know or feel like you need to know. Put the organization first, because that's, as a leader, it's really what you're responsible for. Be passionate about your company's business, not just about technology. Become a student of communication, because doing effective work in most of these other areas depends on communicating effectively. And finally, treat your staff as volunteers. And with that, I think I will turn the mic back over to Will and see if we've got any questions.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, we have questions, and I don't know exactly the best place to start, but I'll just say your 70 and 30% rule seems to have been struck a nerve for many people. With that said, the first question: when the customer cannot be satisfied with 70% of the desired functionality, is it time to break off the engagement entirely?
I think the context there probably depends a lot. We've seen lots of research over the years that says that software developers tend to gold plate or add lots of functionality, that there are huge percentages of functionality that are never used in systems. So I guess I would question the assumption of the customer not being satisfied with 70% of the desired functionality. I would say, have you actually done a terrific job of identifying what the really important functionality is? It's possible that you've just focused on the wrong 70% of the functionality, or for that matter, maybe the wrong 30% of the functionality. So I don't know. I'm not sure I agree with the premise of that question. I would also say, if the question was intended to be responsive to the point about make decisions in the face of ambiguity and be satisfied when you only know 70% of what you need to know, I'm not sure that really the question has anything to do with the scenarios I was imagining. It's has more to do with, is this the right business direction? Is this the right technical direction? That kind of thing. Not so much, do we only have 70% of the functionality defined in the way we need to define it.
Well, that was an excellent response. And now I will continue on the thread. And first, the statement: in software development, sometimes 30% we didn't know or weren't sure about and had to make a decision early on ends up costing us dearly lately, as in architectural decisions. Any suggestions on how to deal with the "I told you so" sayers?
Yeah, well, I think that's so. I mean, this is very much the technical, analytical person's perspective on this issue. Is, we are very concerned about the portion that we don't know, and there's a bit of a sliding scale there. And I give another talk where I make a distinction between judgment and analysis based on Bloom's taxonomy. And I think software development people in general tend to be perhaps overly skilled at analysis. That is, picking apart details in, to a really extreme degree, but underskilled in terms of judgment. And I would say that if it's really true that the 30% you weren't sure about ends up costing dearly, I doubt that has anything to do with a lack of analysis on the 30%. It probably has to do with poor judgment somewhere way up in the decision tree that didn't put enough weight on that 30%, and maybe put an undue amount of weight on the 70% that you did know about. So I would be inclined to interpret that more as a question of, or more as a deficiency in, or a failure of judgment than as a failure of of analysis.
Okay, very good. Now, there's a question on leadership, recognizing that leadership is always a hierarchy. What is your advice for communicating these rules up or down the hierarchy?
I think it's tough to answer that in a 1-minute answer. I think that in general, if you look into really any of the 4-quadrant personality styles, whether it's social style or Myers-Briggs or DISC, I think they're all more or less the same. I personally really like the social style model because it's based on observable behavior rather than necessarily having people take tests before you can know how to interact with them. But I think the key takeaway of really getting in and studying and learning about the different personality types and social styles is that you begin to recognize that it's not that other people are bad or evil or incompetent because they're communicating a certain way. It's just they're wired a little bit differently. Their personal priorities in terms of human interaction are different. And when I've worked with individual contributors and lower level leaders, as well as higher level leaders with personality styles, I find that a lot of times light bulbs go off, and I've heard people say, yeah, I never could get along with this person before, but now that I've gone through this personality style learning, I just realize this person's a different personality. And so, maybe we have a mismatch in the decision-making pace. I like slow decision-making. They like fast decision-making. Maybe we have a mismatch in what we value. I value data. They value relationships. And I don't think most of this stuff is a question of right or wrong. I think most of it is a question of different values. And with technical people, there's a lot of overlap in the orientation and personality types of technical people. And so, we get used to interacting with people who are pretty much like us. And, but I think in the big wide world out there, not including the software world, I think actually the majority of people have a different personality type than the most common type in the software world. So I would say that learning how to interact with people with different personality types, not only will that benefit you and interacting with upper level people in your organization, with sales and marketing people in your organization, it'll also just benefit you with interacting with people in the rest of the world writ large, because unless you spend all your time hanging out with other technical people, there are going to be other people who, in fact, the likelihood is they'll have different personality type than you do.
Yeah, good. Okay, I'd sort of like to combine two questions here. In your view, how does leadership relate to the themes of ethics, diversity, and inclusion? And the second question, which I'm trying to weave in, is do you have any advice when managers do not take responsibility and instead make employees responsible?
Okay, so let's separate those. I see those as pretty different questions. So the first one was, what's the relationship between leadership and diversity? I think ethics and diversity. I think it goes back to the question of, are you in a peacetime manager where everybody's pretty comfortable and you kind of want to keep things the same? Or do you look at it more as a wartime footing where there's some chaos and disruption and the status quo is really not satisfactory and you need to lead people to a different place? So I don't know what the situation is in the organization from the person who asked that question. If they feel like the situation is that it's not satisfactory, because maybe the organization doesn't have enough diversity, then I would just go back to the idea of you've got to have a clear destination. You have to paint the destination vividly so that people know where you're going. And I think in that particular topic, you probably have a mix of people, and some people are dissatisfied with the status quo and want to move, and other people are satisfied with the status quo and actually don't want to move. So then I go back to the John C. Maxwell point about you've got to win people's hearts before you win their minds. And this is not necessarily an intuitive activity for technical leaders. But, if you've got people who aren't on board, who think everything is fine, then I think instead of trying to make rational arguments to them, maybe you got to figure out what's the emotion in play. How do I win these people's hearts? I think most people, not everyone's going to agree with this, but I think most people are pretty fair-minded and want to be pretty fair-minded. And if they don't like the idea of reaching out for more diversity, it's probably because they're actually feeling that in some way that's not a fair idea. And it's an emotional response, not an intellectual response. So I think you got to figure out what the emotion is, and then you got to engage with it at that level.
Thank you. Following up on what you just said, I believe this question is relevant. What do you suggest when a leader believes it is peacetime, when the subordinates correctly understand that they need to cannibalize the current business and disrupt the market? Basically, any tips for a CEO to better gauge whether it's peacetime or wartime? And the comment is, it seems like everybody is in wartime mode all the time, and those who don't become obsolete.
Huh. Yeah, I think I kind of hinted at my answer to this at the very beginning, or when I was introducing this topic, which is, I think most of the history of the software world, things have been changing pretty quickly. And, I think it's been a privilege for me to be working in software for 35 years. And, I started at the point of my career, mainframes were dominant and the IBM PC was just starting to show up. So there was a huge change happening as we switched from mainframe computing to desktop computing. It didn't take too long after that before we switched to client server, which was kind of a pendulum swing back from pure desktop computing. It didn't take too long after that before we switched to internet. Then it didn't take too long after that before we started looking more at mobile. And then it didn't take too long after that before we were into cloud. So, there's always something on the near horizon in software. And I would, I think the safe money is on treating it as if we're on, a wartime footing, or a footing of there being some change that needs to be made. If you have a non-technical CEO and the CEO is complacent and thinks everything's always going to stay exactly the way it is now, at the individual contributor level, I don't know that I have a great answer for you on that one. That sounds like probably not a great fit for a technology company if that's the perspective of the CEO. So I don't have a great answer on that one.
Well, I think that was a good answer, good enough. And I'd like to ask you the question of whether, 7 is a magic number. And in retrospect, are there any breakable or bendable rules that just about made it to your list of unbreakable rules?
Yeah, well, of course, there's the famous paper that says the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. So, obviously, scholarly research says it is a magic number. I like the question. I think it's an interesting question. I think that if I weren't aiming this talk at what I think software leaders most need to hear, there are all kinds of things that could go onto the list. And if I were not aiming the talk at software leaders, I think there are points I wouldn't need to say at all. The communication point, if I'm talking to sales and marketing people, I don't need that point on the list at all. No, I first gave this talk about 10 years ago, and I've looked at the list from various perspectives over the years. In my new book, More Effective Agile, I have a set of 26 key principles. And so I went through my 26 key principles and I compared them to these unbreakable leadership rules. I like the interplay between this particular set and the 26 principles I have in the book. Obviously, the 26 principles are number 1, more detailed. Number 2, more specific to agile development, although not all of them are all that specific to agile development. But we could unpack each of these in more detail and come up with a much bigger list. But I still like this list.
Okay, well, I think that's a perfect segue to this last question about Code Complete contained a list of suggested educational materials. Webcasts, MOOCs, and meetups now exist. What do you suggest now for continued learning?
Yeah.
I think buy your new book.
Well, certainly you can buy my new book, and I would certainly encourage people to check it out. It's available pretty much everywhere. So my company has put a huge amount of effort into software career pathing, and we have extremely well-defined career paths for a variety of disciplines, including people who are going up the software architect path, going from developer to senior developer to technical lead to associate architect and architect. We have agile paths for product owner and agile coach. We have paths for QA manager, going up from tester to SDET to QA manager. So we have really elaborate and highly detailed descriptions of what it takes to get to development or to develop your skills in those areas. I think the question mentioned basically training and books. Our career pathing material includes training, mostly online, which is cool these days because we can do a lot of stuff online that we couldn't do even 10 years ago. And that, I think, opens up lots of opportunity for individual professional development for people to actually take initiative and do it on their own. We also have books and articles, articles, some from ACM, some from IEEE, some from other sources. And then a big part of our focus is on directed experience, because we think that enhanced capability comes from a combination of education and experience. But the experience doesn't have to be just purely random and haphazard. It can actually be focused and directed. And so we have quite significant detail behind the kinds of experiences that we want people to have to improve their capabilities, really no matter what path they're on. So I appreciate the question. That's another really interesting pet topic of mine, one we've put a lot of work into over the years. And on the constructs.com website, we have information about career pathing or professional development. I'd encourage people to check it out.
Perfect. Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time today, and I'd like to thank Steve again for his informative presentation and insightful answers to many questions. A special thanks to each of you for taking the time to attend and participate today. This talk was recorded and will be available online in a few days at learning.acm.org. You can find announcements of upcoming talks and other ACM activities also at learning.acm.org and acm.org. Finally, please fill out the quick survey when you can suggest future topics or speakers, which you should now see on your screen. On behalf of ACM, Steve McConnell and myself, Trace, thanks again for joining us, and I hope you will join us again in the future. This concludes the talk.